Roughly halfway through Final Fantasy VIII, the story takes a sharp turn. The stakes of the narrative become completely different, and most of the established world building is de-emphasized. It's a controversial decision, to say the least, which raises a very simple question. Why? Why would the writers do this? At first glance, it flies in the face of basic story writing principles. Is it just a case of bad writing? Could that really be all it is? Or is there something deeper going on here at a thematic level? Since the very basis of this question is rationalizing a plot twist, we've got to do the spoiler warning early this time. We will be spoiling the entirety of Final Fantasy VIII, from the bosses we fight to the ending of the story. This will be your one and only spoiler warning because the spoilers start now. What I've been alluding to the entire time is, of course, the twist that the main antagonist, Idea, was possessed by a different character, Ultimecia, the entire time. Idea is a very effectively built-up villain. She's shown to be a real threat early on with mind control powers, and later we find out the party also has a deep emotional connection with her. I really like Idea's role in the narrative, but unfortunately, it turns out all of her actions were because of a generically evil sorceress from the future. We don't even meet her until the literal final boss fight. When I first played the game, it felt like such a cop-out. They crafted a genuinely interesting main villain, but they chose just about the most boring possible reason for why she became evil. That's the best way I can put it. Ultimecia is just boring. She's like a dead end for discussion. She's just evil because she is. And that got me thinking, what could possibly be the reason for including Ultimecia in the game? Why was she the reason Idea became evil? And, well, I think I figured out the answer, or at least a possible answer. I'm not talking about an in-universe explanation for Ultimecia. This isn't going to be another one of those Renoa is Ultimecia fan theories. Instead, we're going to be discussing Final Fantasy VIII on a thematic level. What does the story really mean? What are its themes and messages, and how does Ultimecia serve the greater purpose of the narrative? The answer to these questions is much greater than Ultimecia alone, so we're going to have to explore many aspects of the story and really dig deep into certain characters and their motivations. So, with all that being said, let's get into the rest of our obligatory disclaimers. Since this will be a thematic analysis of Final Fantasy VIII, we won't be talking much about the gameplay. While there's certainly a lot I could say about the gameplay and its, unique systems, there's not much I have to add to the discussion that hasn't been said before. Second, I'll give you a heads up now. While I do believe the game is thematically cohesive, I don't think Final Fantasy VIII is a masterpiece in storytelling. I won't be shying away from criticizing it when appropriate. If you disagree with me and think what I consider areas where the story stumbles are actually perfectly fine, then that's totally okay too. Finally, as far as I'm aware, there's no official pronunciation guide for all the Final Fantasy VIII characters' names. I'll be pronouncing them in the way I think sounds the best. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you think I horribly butchered some names. Alright, we're now ready to begin. Welcome to Final Fantasy VIII. I want to begin by proposing a question. Who is Squall? As a character, I mean. I want to build a mini character profile for him, since his background plays a big role in establishing the themes of the story. What's his personality like? What are his interests? His hobbies? Aspirations? Physique? What does he believe in? How does he fit into the world of Final Fantasy VIII? Characters and stories don't exist in a vacuum. They affect and are affected by everything they interact with in the story, too. That's especially true for the protagonist role, which Squall fills. I want to make sure we have a complete understanding of Squall, since I think it's pretty easy to assume a lot of aspects of his character that aren't completely true. Let's try building a character profile from the ground up by analyzing what the game shows us regarding Squall. Let's start off with his physique, since it's our first impression of him. We see it in the opening cinematic with his duel versus Seifer. Squall's got a slick leather jacket, a special weapon called a gunblade, and a neat haircut fitting for a Japanese 90s anime-styled game. We even get to see the creation of his iconic scar from Seifer's gunblade scraping him. He barely flinches at all the blood and gets right back into action. Add it all up, and Squall exudes coolness. This is reinforced by characters in the actual game, too. When Renoa approaches him at the ball, for instance, she calls him the best-looking guy here. When she does so, Squall is leaning against the wall holding a drink, projecting a certain aloofness by not interacting with the party. He doesn't carry himself like an awkward person that's too shy to join in on the fun. It's almost as if he's too cool to be participating. If that's how Squall looks from the outside, what is he actually like? The game does a pretty good job at showing us some characterization for him from the get-go. One of the first details we learn about him is where he sits in the classroom, at the very back. I'm sure you know why people would choose to sit in the back of the class. It's less likely that attention will be drawn to you in the back, less likely for the teacher to call on you, less likely for anyone in the classroom in general to perceive you. Squall prefers to blend into the background. That doesn't stop his teacher, Quistis, from picking on him though. It's clear that he's her favorite student, and it's also clear that Squall is a very good student. He knows pretty much everything there is to know about being a Seed mercenary. That's a pretty consistently shown character trait of Squall for the entire game. He is genuinely good at being a Seed. Later in the game, he constantly gets placed into positions of power. People recognize his ability and trust him to make good decisions. But that's kind of at odds with his personality, isn't it? It's strange for a leader to want to sit in the back of a classroom, or for a leader to not want to socialize with people in general. And that's because Squall doesn't want to be a leader. Squall is initially given the role of squad leader for his first official Seed mission, which he doesn't really comment on. At this point, Squall tolerates being a leader because he was ordered to be one. When the party actually demands him to make tough decisions as a leader though, he says, "I've had it up to here with this leader thing," which I interpret as Squall not viewing himself as a leader, despite others' perception of him. It's not something he wants to be, it's just a thing that he's acting. If it were up to him, he'd be perfectly fine fading into the background just like he did in the classroom. In fact, when Sid places him in charge of commanding the garden, he says, "Are you serious? I don't even have a choice?" This pattern of Squall not liking the idea of leadership is even subtly communicated through gameplay. Did you ever find it strange that Squall defaults to being the second member of the party? The name at the top of your save file indicates who's in the first spot, and that will never be filled by Squall unless you go out of your way to rearrange the party order. So, adding all that up, we can conclude that Squall does not want to be a leader and is fine remaining in the background. What, then, does Squall actually want to do? What are his goals and ambitions? If not to end up in a leadership role, what does he want to achieve? And, well, as it turns out, not much of anything. Squall wants to become a Seed, that much is true. Once he passes the exam, though, his dreams end there. For his entire adolescent life, Squall was working to become a Seed with no desire beyond that. He doesn't even have any hobbies. Everything he did for the past few years of his life was training to become a Seed. He has no real friends. He has no real interests. We even learn that his ballroom dancing skills were just part of his training. Squall is an excellent student with no friends, family, or hobbies to speak of. The longer he lives a life like this, the more he internalizes it as being just who he is. Keep in mind that Squall is pretty young. At the start of the game, he's only 17 years old. His experience training to become a Seed took place in the equivalent of his middle and high school years, which, as we all know, is a pretty formative time in our lives. Squall has cast aside everything about himself so he can most efficiently become a Seed. For the first half of the game, would anything change in the story if Squall were an artificial robot? He certainly doesn't act much different from one, at least. Honestly, in some ways he's worse. He actively pushes away people who try to open up to him, like Quistis on the balcony. We learn later that he closes himself off to others to avoid the pain of losing someone again, but I think this point is where many people, including myself, incorrectly assumed that Squall's demeanor is fully explained. Let me elaborate. When Squall first passes the Seed exam along with 3 others, there's some very interesting dialogue. Sid presents each passing student their Seed rank report, and when he does so, he whispers something to each of them. He tells Selphie, "I'm looking forward to the Garden Festival." To the background character we later learn is named Nita, he says, "Do your best, even if you don't stand out." To Zell, he warns him, "Try to control your emotions a little." Lastly, to Squall, he says, "Finally, a gunblade specialist." Did you notice it? For the first 3 people, Sid gives them a very personalized message. He's aware that Selphie is coordinating the Garden Festival and it's a hobby she's passionate about. Nita is, well, a background character, and Sid appears to be aware of this and doesn't want it to get to him. Sid also knows how prone to emotional outbursts Zell is. Sid demonstrates he's well acquainted with each of the first 3 students. To Squall, though, his message is very different. It's not personal at all. It just addresses Squall by his weapon. It reads as if Sid needed a gunblade specialist, but who carried the gunblade didn't matter at all. He's implying that Squall is not the important one here, it's just his weapon. This single interaction reveals quite a lot. It's true that Squall was pushing others away, yes, but I believe that directly caused others to push him further away too. If Squall is so emotionally distant from everybody that no one really knows him, then it makes total sense why Sid's message is so impersonal. It's not just Sid either. The first trait of Squall we established was that he's cool looking and carries himself well, right? Why did Rinoa approach him at the ball? Because he looked good. It had nothing to do with Squall as a person. Everywhere he goes, people basically objectify him, which certainly doesn't help when Squall is internally objectifying himself too. Throughout the game, whenever Squall displays a hint of emotion, there's always a character that says something like, "Wow, Squall is actually being nice? That's crazy." I don't know about you, but I don't think this is generally a good way to convince a closed-off person to continue opening up. Squall hates all these reactions and just goes right back into his shell. I'm not trying to say that Squall isn't at fault for his behavior, but rather that he was surrounded by people and living in an environment that wasn't conducive to improving this part of him. All of this reinforces Squall's internalization of just wanting to be a seed. When he achieves his goal, he doesn't think of himself as Squall, the seed from Balam Garden, he's just a seed from Balam Garden. He's more or less just a cog in the machine, just a seed in a vast garden, if you will. The combination of both internal and external depersonalizations is what causes Squall to be so cruel. He's on another level of apathy compared to the standard unfriendly hero trope. Squall is genuinely mean, and that's because he doesn't care about anything aside from Seed. At least he truly believes he doesn't care about anything else, but we'll get there later. Before we can talk more about Squall, we have to spend some time discussing Seifer. He's probably the most obvious foil character I've ever seen. Squall and Seifer were both training to be a seed. They're both socially abrasive. They both use a gunblade. They even both have the same scar, but the slants are in opposite directions. We're clearly meant to draw comparisons between them. The main way they differentiate from each other is how Seifer will gladly break rules or disobey orders if he thinks he has a better solution. That's the main reason why Seifer fails the Seed exam. It has nothing to do with how callously he treats his teammates. He calls Zell a chicken wuss and is just generally pretty rude. Honestly though, he's not much less rude than Squall is. He's just a lot more vocal than Squall. Actually, continuing that thought, Squall and Seifer aren't so different. Both of them are very serious about their work, and Squall seems to respect him on some level. We can see that illustrated through Squall's inner thoughts. For example, when Zell is looking to Squall for reassurance after his mistake of revealing they were Seed members to the Galbadian president, Squall just doesn't give him any. He very bluntly tells Zell that it's possible Galbadia retaliates and that Garden might lose. Zell understands this already, but right now he's just looking for somebody to give him a simple, everything will work out. Rinoa calls him out for his callousness and tells him to just say anything encouraging. Squall then thinks to himself, that's just to ease your mind. Am I the only one who thinks that? No, I'm sure Seifer. And he trails off, but this establishes a very important connection. Squall and Seifer have similar thought processes. It's more than them just superficially having similar design elements. They also follow a similar belief system. The key difference between them is that Seifer is willing to break the rules while Squall likes to play by the book. The main takeaway I want you to get from this is that Squall sees himself in Seifer. So we've established Squall has internalized being a mindless drone, and you may be thinking, what on earth does that have to do with why Ultimecia is in the story of Final Fantasy VIII? That's a reasonable question, but we've got a bit more to analyze before we can get there. We need to figure out the central theme of the game first, and then we can put the pieces together. Here's a different question to think about. How does Squall feel about his life? We know he wants to remain an unnoteworthy seed, but does he actually like that he's working toward that goal? How does he feel about himself? That might seem silly to argue that there could be a disconnect here, but I think there is. I don't believe Squall actually understands himself. The strongest evidence for this point comes from when the party is discussing the rumor that Seifer was executed. While this is going on, Squall has a conversation with himself in his head. Squall reaffirms that he actually likes Seifer, but then he says something really interesting. He says that Seifer has become just a memory, and because we know that Squall sees himself in Seifer, he immediately jumps to wondering how people would act if he died. Squall was this and that, using past tense, saying whatever they want. So this is what death is all about. Not for me, I won't have it. Afterward, Squall suddenly interrupts the conversation by yelling, "I won't have it, I'm not having anyone talk about me in the past tense," and sprints out of the room. Squall is deeply uncomfortable with the idea of his own death, and I believe it's because Squall subconsciously knows he's working toward an unfulfilling life. His singular dream, if you could call it that, was to just be another seed. Someone who could get the job done, but wouldn't leave an impact on the world or people around him beyond that. All that anyone could say about him would be past tense descriptions of how they viewed him. That's what they're all doing to Seifer right now. Squall knows that Seifer was devoted to his work just like him, so he can easily see himself heading toward a future and legacy like Seifer's appears to be. That really scares Squall, and it's all because, on some level, he knows that he doesn't want to live the life his current path is taking him. He wants to leave an actual legacy. Unfortunately, he's too emotionally stunted to articulate this. That's why he just kind of freaks out and runs away. To me at least, this is the single most important detail for understanding Squall as a character. That's why I don't understand why the game never brings up his outburst again. The game just moves on as if it never happened. No character ever comments on it or asks if he's okay. And I mean, sure, maybe Squall hasn't earned their sympathy, but Squall himself doesn't acknowledge it ever again either. He never tries to calm himself down. He never says that he'll work to avoid being in the past tense or something along those lines. Maybe you could argue that the lack of emphasis on Squall's reaction here implies it's not actually that important, but I disagree when it's the most emotion we've gotten out of Squall by far at this point in the story. It really stands out, and I wish they did just a little more with the idea to make the story flow more naturally. With the rumors of Seifer's death, the seed has been planted in Squall's mind that maybe his goal isn't what he actually wants to do. He's still not consciously aware and won't be for a very long time, but the roots are beginning to grow. They'll be watered when it's revealed that Balam Garden is secretly controlled by this weird yelling blob creature motivated strictly by greed and profit. This is Norg, the master of Balam Garden. Apparently, he's the one that all the garden attendants answer to, not Headmaster Sid. This is news to the entire party, but particularly Squall is who takes offense. When Norg claims that Balam Garden is his garden, we get another rare emotional outburst from Squall. He very strongly denies Norg's claim and says that garden is not just his. Here's another indication that what Squall actually wants is at odds with what he thinks he wants. If he were truly content with just being another cog in the machine, then Norg's claim shouldn't bother him. Whoever controls Garden wouldn't matter as long as Squall got to continue his job. After Norg's defeat, it's revealed that the true goal of Seed was to train soldiers to defeat the sorceress. Norg's vision of making a profitable mercenary line came later, and he ended up being more influential than Sid. Garden was corrupted from the inside, and I believe that this is symbolic of Squall's undesirable aspirations. What he's been working toward his entire life is not actually what he wanted. Norg's greed isn't what he thought Seed represented, but he also didn't know about the goal of killing the sorceress. Either way, for Squall to remain a cog in the garden machine, he would have to accept that the machine itself is broken, what Norg represents, or that he has no idea what the machine is used for, what Sid's side represents. Squall, subconsciously at least, doesn't like either of these options. This is highlighted shortly after Sid places him in command. Sid tells Squall that it's his destiny to lead the way in defeating the sorceress, and Squall takes issue with that. He doesn't like the implication that it's been decided since his birth. He then thinks to himself that he doesn't actually mind fighting the sorceress as long as he's a seed, but then something very interesting happens. Squall says, "What? As long as I'm a seed member? What if I quit?" Quit. Then what? What do I have left? Don't even want to think about it. Just stop thinking. Squall is so close to figuring himself out here. He's on the edge of realizing that he doesn't want to be a seed member. He doesn't want to be a cog in the machine. He doesn't want to just mindlessly follow orders, but that's all he's done for nearly his entire childhood. Being a standard seed member is all he has, so he convinces himself that he can't quit. He convinces himself to stop thinking, to go back to being a cog. You may have heard of something called the sunk cost fallacy before. If not, it's what people experience when they've invested a lot of resources into something and use that as justification to keep going, even though quitting would be in their actual best interest. I believe that is what's going on in Squall's head. Let me be clear that I don't think the conclusion is Squall should just quit Seed right now. The real issue comes from one of the very first traits we established of Squall. He doesn't want to be a leader. At least that's what he thinks. He spent so much time being a perfect role model Seed mercenary and had no interest in standing out, but all signs are pointing to the fact that he does want to be more important than that. He doesn't want to let others define him in the past tense. He wants to be a leader, or at least the type of person that can leave an impact on others or the world itself. He just tragically doesn't understand himself and continues to reiterate that he doesn't like this whole leader thing. For Squall to truly be happy and start enjoying his life, he needs to let go of who he thought he was. That's the part he needs to abandon. Let me also emphasize that there's nothing wrong with wanting to live a humble, uneventful life. The problem is Squall thinks he wants to do this, but actually doesn't. He wants to leave an impact on the world. It doesn't have to be through becoming a leader in Seed, but that is a potential avenue for Squall. Alright, we've now finally established enough information to get an idea of what Final Fantasy VIII is actually about. This concept of self-reflection and letting go of old desires. We don't know enough to claim what the actual message of the game's story is yet, but it's clear that this is the path Squall must walk if he wants to live a fulfilling life. We've spent a long time focusing on Squall and his lack of dreams, but I think we've exhausted most of what we can say about him for now. Let's turn our attention back to Squall's foil, Seifer, and see if his dreams can give us any more insight to the themes of the game. Before going further, I'll quickly clarify that Seifer isn't actually dead. He was just rumored to be, and I think that might have been confusing if you're unfamiliar with the game's story. Anyway, Seifer alludes to having a romantic dream very early on during the Seed practical exam. He doesn't tell us what his dream is, just that it exists. Luckily for us, we explicitly learn what Seifer's dream is later, so we don't need to do any extra analysis. Seifer's romantic dream was to be a knight. He wants to protect somebody, and he's had this dream since his childhood. After the attack on the broadcast, Seifer is given the opportunity to fulfill his dream by the sorceress Idea. Let's pay close attention to what Idea says when she's convincing Seifer to follow her. The boy in you is telling you to come. The adult in you is telling you to back off. Seifer initially resists, but soon finds himself walking lockstep with Idea and becoming her loyal knight. What's going on here, thematically speaking? Seifer is being compelled to follow his long-held dream and is casting aside everything else about him. The use of boy and adult in Idea's words are very telling. We can liken boy to being Seifer's immature side, while the adult is his mature side. The immature part of Seifer wants to continue following his dream. The problem with this, though, is that his dream is corrupted. Idea is not herself. Idea is possessed by an evil witch. Seifer wouldn't be protecting anything meaningful. But it looks like what Seifer wanted on the surface. It kind of fits the bill, at least. It's only when you look deeper do you realize that Seifer doesn't become a knight at all, but rather Ultimecia's loyal lapdog. On some level, Seifer is aware of this unfortunate truth. That's his mature side, or the adult in him. He denies it, though, and continues down the path of the dream doomed to end in unhappiness. The only way to save Seifer at this point is to convince him to let go of Idea. Is this sounding a little familiar? In the interest of being fair, I want to present another interpretation of this scene when we have the full context of the game's characters. Squall, Selphie, Zell, Irvine, and Quistis, along with Seifer, all grew up in an orphanage together run by Idea. They called her matron, and she was their foster mother for their young childhoods. With this knowledge, we could then read Idea's dialogue here as trying to coax Seifer's childhood memories out of him to persuade him to follow her. The boy in Seifer recognizes Idea as matron, but the adult doesn't. The issue I have with this interpretation is the thematic implication that Seifer's childhood is what's leading him astray. I don't think this aligns with the rest of the game's story. The best example ironically comes from probably the worst scene in the game, when the party suddenly remembers they all grew up together. I have no defense for this plot device. Look, I don't think the twist of the party having grown up together and forgetting about it is inherently bad. It's even foreshadowed with Eleni somehow knowing Quistis at the start of the game. My problem is if a story is going to include collective amnesia as a method for temporarily withholding information, it better have a satisfying explanation for why it happens. The excuse that Guardian forces somehow cause you to lose memories is just unsatisfying. It's not built up whatsoever before the reveal, and there's not a single consequence of how it affects memory later in the game either. I could buy something like maybe Idea sealed away their memories and the party coming together allowed them to be restored, but that is simply not what happens. The only good part of this story element is that it helps prove my point. When the party is working up the motivation to challenge Idea, it's remembering their childhood that gives them strength. I can't reconcile this with the interpretation that Idea's words are literally referring to Seifer's childhood and adulthood. The figurative interpretation I proposed earlier keeps the theming of the game consistent. Let's get back to Seifer in the present. While it's not the same exact struggle, Squall and Seifer find themselves in similar positions. Their current life trajectories won't actually be fulfilling. They both subconsciously are aware of this, but can't express it and continue to hurt themselves. Now with that being said, we can finally see what sort of role Ultimecia is filling in the story. We can say that Idea represents Seifer's dream of knighthood. She's symbolic of the key for Seifer to live a life that he's happy with. If it were just Idea, she'd be a perfectly worthy subject for Seifer to serve. But it's not Idea, it's Ultimecia. It follows then that Ultimecia is a symbolic dead end. Seifer dedicating his life to Ultimecia isn't even close to the same thing as becoming Idea's knight. It would just end in a waste of his potential and he wouldn't ever truly feel satisfied. Maybe that's why her name is Ultimecia. It's got roots in the Latin word ultimus, meaning final. Continuing down the path of serving possessed Idea will just result in Ultimecia's total victory. Seifer, however, becomes another victim of the sunk cost fallacy. We fight him several times throughout the game, and he never wavers on supporting the sorceress. Even when Ultimecia takes over for real, Seifer continues serving her because it's all he has left. On some level, he knows it's wrong, but keeps on going. He needs to let go, but he stubbornly holds on. That's the conclusion that his friends, Raijin and Fujin, try to get him to realize at the end of the game too. Fujin breaks her speaking quirk to tell Seifer plainly, "You've lost yourself and your dream." In fact, all the people around Seifer decide that supporting Ultimecia is a lost cause in the lead-up to his final stand. Biggs and Wedge, two minor recurring antagonists, quit their jobs at the very end of the game. We're being shown from every angle what Seifer should do, but he sadly won't listen. Seifer is clearly an example of what not to do when your actions are taking you down a path you don't want to travel. That's the real reason why Ultimecia exists in the game's narrative. She's a symbol for going down the wrong path, a manifestation of a dead end. While it doesn't really excuse Ultimecia not being fleshed out as her own character, I think it's a satisfying enough reason for why Idea was written to be possessed. The symbolism becomes even stronger when you consider Ultimecia's goal is to achieve time compression. That would be when past, present, and future all blend together and create a reality where only Ultimecia exists. If all time were to exist simultaneously, then the concept of time itself wouldn't really be a thing anymore. Ultimecia would simply become all that there ever was and all that there ever will be, a dead end to existence. Is this part a bit of a stretch? Absolutely, but I think it fits with the narrative we've established. So then, what's the conclusion? When we see Ultimecia, it's a symbol of a dead-end path that we need to let go of? That makes sense to me. We see what we aren't supposed to do with Seifer, and we know that he's a foil for Squall, so we should see Squall come to the conclusion that letting go of who we thought he wanted to be is what he needs to do. Cool. So why does Renoa get possessed by Ultimecia? Huh. That kind of flies in the face of everything we've talked about, doesn't it? When Renoa goes into her coma, Squall realizes that he's in love with her and desperately doesn't want to lose her. If we continue with our reading of Ultimecia, then the logical conclusion is that Squall needs to let go of Renoa, but I don't think romance stories are meant to end with the hero giving up on the love interest and leaving them to waste away. I think we need to try retracing some steps. Not our steps, though. Someone else's steps, that they took roughly 17 to 18 years ago. Laguna is an amazing character. He's a down-to-earth, slightly awkward, funny soldier with a heart of gold. The party is shown visions of him and his comrades throughout the game, with Squall usually taking the point of view of Laguna himself. It's pretty ironic when Laguna and Squall couldn't be more different. Why are we talking about Laguna, though? Well, it's because he's another foil character for Squall. While it's more common for foils to be opposed to each other, like Seifer is with Squall, it's not required. Laguna has a lot of visible similarities to Squall, which naturally draws comparison, but obviously the fact that Squall's point of view is literally tied to Laguna indicates that the two are also tied together thematically. Unlike Squall, Laguna is portrayed in a very positive light. We're meant to like him, but that's not a difficult demand when he's just so likable on his own. That's partly due to Squall being pretty miserable, so Laguna's positive traits stand out. The real hook to get us to love Laguna is his crush on the piano lady, Julia. He's incredibly sheepish, and it takes some drinks and encouragement from his buddies to finally go talk to her. Turns out, though, that Julia has been wanting to talk to him for some time. She invites him up to her hotel room, and after Laguna manages to work up the courage to follow through, they spend hours together. Hours of Laguna passionately talking her ear off about his life, dreams, and what he's interested in before passing out from exhaustion. It's very wholesome, and it's clear that Julia takes a liking to Laguna afterward. He inspires her to write the love song Eyes on Me, which plays a couple of times later in the game. That's about where our first vision of Laguna's adventure ends, so when we see him again in the future, we expect to be updated on his blossoming relationship with Julia. Instead, though, we see that Laguna and Julia haven't spoken since that night. We learn Julia actually married General Caraway, making her Renoa's eventual mother, and Laguna now has eyes for a small farm town woman named Rain. He's become a fatherly figure for Eleni, Rain's adopted daughter. When Laguna's old friend, Kiros, tracks him down in this small village, we can ask him how Julia is doing, and that's when we learn she got married and didn't wait for her soldier love to come back. I find Laguna's response to this very interesting. He says, without hesitation and with a lot of emotions, "So what? Who cares? As long as she's happy, right? That's all that matters. Ain't that right, Elle?" Laguna reacts very strongly against the insinuation that he might be upset with Julia moving on, and I think he does so for a simple reason. He's also completely moved on. I view Julia as a representation of Laguna's old life as a soldier. It's who he used to be, but that time in his life is over. There's nothing wrong with that, it just is. Rain and Eleni represent Laguna's new life, and that's the one he knows with all his heart and soul is what he wants to live. It's also the life that Laguna fights tooth and nail to protect. When Eleni is kidnapped, Laguna does everything in his power to get her back, down to supporting a resistance faction in a foreign country. What we see here is an example of Laguna letting go of what he thought he wanted in favor of holding on to the life he really wants. At least until he doesn't. Laguna's not perfect either, and he'll be the first to tell you that. Rain died, presumably from a sudden illness, while Laguna was busy being a revolutionary president of the country he just helped overthrow. In fairness to Laguna, it was for the sake of Eleni since she was the target of Sorceress Adele's followers and Laguna's primary responsibility is keeping Adele sealed away, but he deeply regrets not going back to Rain to savor what little time they had left. It's bittersweet, but my interpretation is that Laguna knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he wanted to be a humble family man. Not even what Rain says in private will convince me otherwise. Unfortunately, Laguna was caught up in circumstances outside of his control and tried to make do with the cards he was dealt by protecting the world, and therefore Eleni, from the sorceress. What can we learn from Laguna's life? We learned from Seifer that quadrupling down on a dream-turned nightmare is probably not a good way to achieve happiness in life, and we know that Squall is subconsciously unhappy with the life he was choosing to live. We know Squall needs to let go. The problem with letting go, as we saw with Seifer, is it's easy to say, but very hard to do when we can't see what else is out there. If we let go of our life's goal and don't find anything to replace it, then what was the point? Nothing has actually changed. The missing step is what we do after letting go, and that is what Final Fantasy VIII is really getting at. If there's something in your life that you truly, with your heart, soul, and everything in between, know is what you want to live for, then you need to hold on to that. There's a key difference between Ultimecia's influence over Rinoa and Idea. In the first half of the game, Idea was already corrupted by Ultimecia. She was completely gone. In the final act of the game, Rinoa hasn't been yet. Rinoa can still be saved by defeating Ultimecia herself. In this instance, Ultimecia's presence in Rinoa is only symbolic of the potential that this path could be a dead end. The crazy thing is, though, everything in life has the potential to not work out. There's no guarantees, but Squall knows that Rinoa is a risk worth taking. After Squall and Rinoa land back on the planet after their space adventure, where Squall finally gets a little bit in touch with his emotions, Rinoa is taken into custody so she can be sealed away to prevent Ultimecia from overtaking her. Squall doesn't fight back, he lets her go. That's the practical answer to this situation, what a seed would do. Seed, after all, was formed to kill the sorceress, so why would Seed allow a sorceress to continue living a normal life? Squall letting Rinoa go would just be acceptance of the fact that he will always remain a cog loyally turning inside the Seed machine. Symbolically speaking, this is Squall's critical moment. Does he let Rinoa be sealed away, or does he go back on all of his training and decide to live the life he wants? A life where he can make an impact on the world in the most simple way possible, by falling in love with someone and living their future together. Squall, of course, makes the correct choice. He breaks Rinoa out of her confinement and the party goes on to defeat Ultimecia in the future and save the day. It's not without complications, though. When everyone needs to return back to present time, Squall accidentally goes to the past. He arrives in Idea's orphanage and finds both Idea and a younger version of himself. Idea asks Squall who he is, and he answers that he's a seed from Balam Garden. Huh. That kind of seems at odds with everything we've talked about once again. Squall is fixated on the past and introduces himself as a generic seed. Okay, I know the in-universe explanation is that calling himself Squall would just confuse Idea and who knows if temporal paradoxes exist in this world, but that doesn't change the imagery we see. Squall stuck in the past and reiterating the life he knows he doesn't really want. Why include this scene at all? Well, the answer to that question is, I have no idea. But I do have a theory. Think back to roughly a few seconds ago. I said something a little misleading. Did you pick up on it? I said that Squall was fixated on and stuck in the past in a metaphorical sense, but that's not really what's happening here. Squall is literally in the past. Take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. I'm well aware this is a bit of a stretch, but hear me out. If Squall is literally in the past, then could we say that, right now, Squall is living in the past tense? The very thing he had his emotional outburst over at the beginning of the game? The past tense that we established represents Squall not leaving an impact on the world, letting others describe him plainly with past tense words? And how does Squall escape this past tense? He tries his best to think of Rinoa, the person he wants to spend the rest of his life with, the person who gives him a reason to live, the person who showed him he needs to let go of his mindless seed life to be happy, the person who showed him how he wants to live. It's difficult, though. Squall struggles to remember her face. Breaking a mindset you've had for your entire childhood is incredibly challenging. Squall doesn't really waver in his mindset for most of the game either because of how ingrained it is in his psyche. Eventually, Squall's mind breaks and he collapses. He can't remember. He can't find the reason to live anymore. He lets Rinoa go, like when he let her get taken away to be sealed off forever. Soon enough, though, Rinoa finds Squall, and while we don't see it happen, Squall eventually turns out okay now that he and Rinoa finally reunited, just like when Squall breaks Rinoa free. If you read this series of events in a figurative way, then it lines up pretty closely with the entire storyline we've been focusing on. Admittedly, this point would probably be a bit stronger if we actually saw Squall wake up when Rinoa held him, but I also understand wanting to leave the audience thinking Squall died so they can have the big reveal at the end of the credits that it's a happy ending. We do see the bleak landscape turn into a field full of life at least, which is an indicator that something happened here to make everything okay. Before we wrap up, there's just one quick little aside I want to talk about. I mentioned it in the intro of this video, but I want to discuss the fan theory that Rinoa and Ultimecia are the same person at different points in time. On paper, it's a cool way to make the disappointingly simple main villain of the game much more complex and interesting, but I don't think it fits into the story on a thematic level. If the game is about recognizing when to let go and when to hold on, then Rinoa becoming Ultimecia flies in the face of Squall's character-defining moment of freeing Rinoa from her tomb. It would turn his noble decision into yet another example of holding on to something that was already fated to end in failure. I'll even give you this. Let's say the entire video was nonsense and none of what we talked about was actually relevant to the game's real story. It still flies in the face of Squall's character development of finally opening up to people, making genuine connections, and finding love. Alright, it's time to bring it home. What have we learned today from Final Fantasy VIII? I think everyone could do with some regular self-reflection about who they currently are and who they want to be in the future. Just, check-ins, I guess? I'll even ask you, dear viewer, to do it right now. Are you doing what you want to do in life currently? Like, really? If not, why? It's okay if the answer is no or you don't know. The important thing is you need to know what your answer is so you can take as much action as you can afford to change it if it's one you don't like. That's where Squall went wrong. He didn't really know what he wanted. That was partially due to his environment and the people around him reinforcing his beliefs, but I think if Squall really sat down with himself for a while, he might have come up with a better answer than just being a regular seed. So, don't be like Squall. Don't let the amount of time and effort you've poured into something dissuade you from going down a different path if you know it will be the one that leads to your personal fulfillment. We have now finally reached the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider leaving a like, comment, and subscribing so I can make more videos like these. The channel has been doing really well the past couple of months, and I want to keep the momentum going. Before we truly end, there are a couple of things I wanted to mention that didn't quite fit anywhere in the script. First, I have a little secret to fill you in on. I don't actually like Final Fantasy VIII that much. The junction system is certainly a love it or hate it type of thing, and I unfortunately fall in the latter camp. On top of that, though, I think the storytelling has some serious issues beyond the ones I mentioned earlier. The most egregious one in my eyes is, unfortunately, the main emotional selling point of the game, the romance between Squall and Rinoa. I can believe that Squall was suppressing his emotions and didn't understand how he felt about Rinoa, sure, but I don't really buy how Rinoa fell in love with Squall in the first place. He's nothing but cold and cruel to her for the entire game until a switch suddenly flips while Rinoa is in her coma. I think we could have used an extra intermediate step or two in their relationship development. Overall, I think the best way to describe Final Fantasy VIII for me personally is a game with a lot of great ideas but poor execution. It's not my least favorite Final Fantasy game by any means, but it is toward the bottom of my rankings. If you disagree with me, feel free to share your perspective in the comments. Second, I wanted to give a mini channel update. At the time of posting this video, we've crossed the 2,500 subscriber milestone, so I wanted to say thank you so much for all your support. I really take this channel seriously, so it's going to go through an aesthetic redesign pretty soon. We're gonna get a new profile picture that's more fitting for the content I make, a fancy channel banner, and I'm also planning on upgrading my computer setup in the next couple of months. In terms of future videos, I'm happy to announce that yes, I will be covering more Final Fantasy games. I cannot tell you the order that I'll make the videos in or when they'll come out, since not even I know that, but I think it'd be cool to cover the entire mainline Final Fantasy series in some form eventually. The more story-focused entries will get thematic analyses like this video, and the earlier, simpler games will probably focus on game design or design philosophy in general. I do enjoy making those types of videos too, by the way, so you'll probably see some of those in the future sprinkled in alongside the thematic analyses. If you have no idea what I'm referring to, check out my video on Chrono Trigger. Alright, that's it for real. Thank you once again for watching, and see you next time.